Welcome back to Take Care Time, the tales and the exhales of caregivers. I'm your host, Beverly Nance, and I need to tell you something before we begin today. This episode is hard. Not hard in a way that makes you want to turn it off. Hard in a way that makes you want to lean in. Hard in a way that feels uncomfortably familiar if you have ever loved someone who was struggling and watched them smile at you while hiding something behind their back. Because that is where we are today. We left Cyndi and Christopher in what felt like, maybe, possibly, hopefully, a turning point. Dr. Reyes had named the thing. Christopher had nodded. A new plan was in place. And that night, Cyndi had poured 2 glasses of wine, and they had sat together, and it felt, for a moment, like the beginning of something better. And here is the thing about turning points in real life. They are rarely as clean as they feel in the moment. Sometimes, what looks like a turning point is just a pause before the next fall. And sometimes, the person you love most in the world looks you straight in the eye and tells you everything is fine, and means it, and lies. At the same time, not because they are a bad person, but because that is what addiction does. It started small. It almost always does. In the week following the appointment with Dr. Reyes, Christopher was compliant. That is the word that shows up in the medical notes, and I think it is worth sitting with for a moment because it is such a clinical word for such a complicated thing. Compliant. He took his medication on the adjusted schedule. He attended his therapy appointments. He participated in conversations Dr. Reyes wanted them both to have. He was present. He was trying. And Cyndi, who had spent weeks watching and logging and second-guessing herself, allowed herself to exhale. That exhale, I keep coming back to it because I understand it so completely. When you have been holding your breath for so long, when you have been vigilant and careful and afraid, the moment things seem to stabilize feels like permission. Permission to stop watching so hard. Permission to let your guard down just a little bit. Permission to believe that maybe the hard part is behind you. And maybe you have felt that too. That cautious, fragile exhale. The one where you tell yourself not to get too comfortable, but you get a little comfortable anyway because you are so tired of being scared. Cyndi got comfortable. Not irresponsibly, not carelessly, just humanly. And Christopher noticed. The first trip happened on a Thursday morning. Cyndi was in the garage. She had started a new batch. A wine that was very petite. She had been wanting to try for 2 seasons. It required patience and attention and a willingness to wait longer than feels comfortable before it becomes what it is meant to be. She was measuring specific gravity, making notes, completely absorbed in the rhythm of it. Christopher poked his head through the garage door. He told her he was going to drive over to the hardware store. He said Denny had called about some paperwork for business, and he needed to pick up a few things. He seemed fine, normal. The Christopher she recognized, purposeful, direct, not wasting words. She waved without looking up from her notebook. She said, okay. He was gone for 2.5 hours. The hardware store was 11 minutes from their house. When he came back, he had a bag from the hardware store. The receipt inside showed 3 items that cost less than $20. He put the bag on the kitchen counter and went to lie down. Cyndi noticed the time. She noticed the bag. She did not say anything. She went back to the garage and wrote one line in her notebook. 2.5 hours, hardware store, $20. And then she closed the notebook because she did not want to open the next chapter of this story just yet. I want to pause here and talk about something that I think is really important for caregivers to understand. Not because understanding it makes it easier, it does not, but because understanding it can change the way you interpret what you are seeing. And for a caregiver who has already done the impossible work of trying to separate love from enabling, concern from control, vigilance from paranoia, that context matters. When someone is in active addiction, their behavior follows patterns that are remarkably consistent across different people, different substances, different circumstances. Addiction researchers and clinicians have studied these patterns for decades, and what they have found is that the behaviors we tend to judge most harshly, the lying, the hiding, the elaborate excuses, the apparent double life, are not simply moral failures. They are the predictable expression of a brain that has been hijacked. Here's what I mean by that. When the brain becomes dependent on an opioid, the drug essentially rewires the reward and survival systems. The brain begins to treat obtaining and using the substance the way it would treat any survival behavior, like eating or breathing or protecting yourself from danger. The drive is that fundamental, that urgent. And the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for judgment, for impulse control, for weighing long-term consequences against short-term relief, becomes progressively less able to override that drive. Which means that Christopher, sitting in the car outside the hardware store, was not making a rational calculation. He was thinking, I will lie to Cyndi and risk everything we have built together because I want to feel good for a few hours. He was not that cold. He was not that calculated. He was desperate in a way that felt to his brain like survival. And his brain was wrong. But it was also completely neurologically convinced that it was right. This is the part that caregivers often find the hardest to hold. The person you love is doing something that is destroying your trust, your stability, your peace. And they are doing it because their brain is telling them that they have no choice. But both of those things are true at the same time. Both. And you are allowed to be furious about it and heartbroken about it and exhausted by it all at once. You do not have to pick just one feeling. Over the following weeks, Christopher built a world inside the world. That is the only way I know how to describe it. He was still Christopher on the surface. He still made coffee in the morning. He still watched college football on Saturdays. He still asked Cyndi about her batches, what stage the petite wine was in, whether the pH had come down the way she wanted. He was present enough, engaged enough, normal enough. But underneath that, quietly and methodically, he was solving a problem. The problem was that the prescription Dr. Reyes had adjusted was no longer enough. Not enough to manage the pain, which was real, still real, the ribs, the shoulder, the wrists that ached in the cold, but not enough to satisfy the other need. The one that had grown up alongside the pain and was now just as loud, maybe louder, and had nothing to do with his injuries at all. So he found other sources. It is worth understanding how this happens, because I think there is still a misconception that people who obtain opioids outside of a prescription are somehow different, more criminal, more reckless, more morally compromised than people who get them from a doctor. The reality is far from ordinary and far more heartbreaking than that. For many people in Christopher's situation, the path from legitimate prescription to outside sources is not dramatic. It's incremental. It begins with someone at the job site who mentions casually that they have extra pills from their own surgery. It continues with an acquaintance who knows someone. It moves to a neighborhood where these transactions happen, in parking lots and at the end of driveways and in the front seats of pickup trucks. Christopher was a construction contractor. He has spent his entire adult life in a world of job sites and crews and the particular masculine culture of physical work, where pain is managed privately and stoically and often chemically. He knew that, and some of those people knew other people. The hardware store trip was not actually about hardware. The first one was just reconnaissance. The second was a transaction. He was careful about money. He had his own accounts, business accounts that Cyndi did not monitor closely because they had never needed to be monitored. Small withdrawals, amounts that looked like lunch or coffee or a tank of gas, nothing that would flag, nothing that would alarm. He was good at this. And that is the thing that I think broke Cyndi's heart the most, when she eventually understood what had been happening. Not the addiction itself, not what was devastating, but the competence of it, the organization, the precision. Because the Christopher she loved had always been precise. He had always been organized. He was always the person in the room that knew exactly what he was doing and why. She had loved that about him. And now, those same qualities were being used to hide from her. Meanwhile, Cyndi was making the best wine of her life. I say that without irony and without judgment, because it is true, and because I think it is one of the most painfully human things about this story. While Christopher was building a secret world, Cyndi was building something too, something real and beautiful and entirely hers. The petite wine was coming along in a way that made her catch her breath when she held the sample to the light, deep purple, almost black at the center, bleeding to the violet at the rim, the kind of color that makes you stop what you're doing. She had started keeping a more detailed notebook, not just batch notes, measurements, temperatures, gravity, readings, but actual reflective writing, thoughts she was having, observations, things she noticed in the wine that seemed to say something about her life. She wrote one night, "The petite wine still does not apologize for being tannic. It does not soften itself to be more approachable. It says, wait. It says, I am worth the patience. I think I have forgotten how to say that about myself." She closed the notebook, held her glass, looked at the door that led to the back of the house, and stayed in the garage a little longer. And here is the thing I want to be careful about here, because it would be easy and wrong to frame Cyndi's time in the garage as negligence, as abandonment, as the reason things spiraled the way they did. It was not that. Cyndi was not responsible for Christopher's addiction. She was not responsible for the choices he was making in the parking lots. She was not responsible for the gap between what he told her and what was true. What she was responsible for, what she would later grapple with honestly and bravely, was the question of what she knew and when she chose to know it. That 2.5-hour hardware store trip, the notebook entry she had written and then closed, the slight evasiveness she had noticed in his eyes at breakfast and filed under tired. She had data. She was not ready to look at it directly. Maybe you have the data too. Data you were not quite ready to look at because looking at it directly will require you to do something, and doing something will require you to give up the fragile piece you finally found. And I'm not here to judge that. I'm here to name it. Let me talk for a few minutes about the signs that often go unnoticed when a loved one has moved from prescription dependency to active outside sourcing, because I think this is genuinely important caregiver education, and I think a lot of people are sitting with these signs right now and not quite connecting them. The first thing that changes is time. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, but subtle. Trips that take a little longer than they should, errands with vague destinations, a willingness to run out for things that could easily wait, combined with a subtle urgency that does not quite match the stated reason. Christopher was going to the hardware store, to a former coworker's house to return borrowed tools, to a part of town where he claimed to be meeting with a subcontractor about business. The reasons were plausible. They were the kinds of reasons a person like Christopher would legitimately have. That is what makes it so hard. The second sign is money. Small, irregular withdrawals, cash being used for things that usually go on a card, a resistance, gentle but present, to talking about finances in any detail, not a dramatic change, just a slight shift in the level of transparency that had always existed before. The third sign, and this is the one that Cyndi noticed most acutely without fully understanding what she was noticing, is mood unpredictability that does not track with the stated reason. Christopher was sometimes irritable in the mornings in a way that felt chemical rather than situational. He was sometimes unnaturally calm in the evenings in a way that did not match the day they both had. The emotional rhythm of the house had a rhythm to it that did not quite correspond to anything visible. Cyndi had been tracking mood for months. She knew his rhythms, and something was off. She just did not know what she was looking at. The fourth sign is the disappearing acts, not physical disappearance. Christopher was home, present, accounted for, but a certain quality of presence was missing. He was there, but not quite reachable, available, but somehow distant. The lights were on, but something behind them had changed. Caregivers often describe this as the person being hollowed out, like there's less of them than it used to be, like they were performing normalcy rather than inhibiting it. Cyndi started to feel like she was living with a very good impression of her husband. It was Denny who first said something out loud. Denny had been Christopher's foreman for 9 years. He had been running Marlowe Construction in Christopher's absence since the accident, and he had done it with a quiet competence that Christopher had trusted completely. They spoke regularly, business calls, mostly, about projects and payroll and client concerns. But one afternoon in late February, Denny called Cyndi directly. He did not call to talk about business. He called because Christopher had been showing up. Not to the office. Christopher was still technically on medical leave, but no job sites, unannounced, at odd times. He would appear in the middle of the afternoon, walk the site for an hour, interact with the crew, and there was something about him, Denny said, something he could not quite name, that was not quite right. He seems off, Denny said, and then, after a pause that felt like it cost him something, he is not all the way there, Cyndi. Something is wrong. Denny was not a man who made phone calls like this easily. Cyndi knew that. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long time after the call ended. She thought about the 2.5-hour hardware store trip. She thought about the notebook entry she had written and closed. She thought about the lights on, but nobody home quality she had been noticing for weeks. And she thought about how much easier it would be to not know. And then she thought about Denny, 9 years of loyalty, a man who called her husband boss and meant it, picking up the phone because he was worried enough about the discomfort of making the call was less than the discomfort of staying quiet. She opened her notebook. She read the entries for the last 6 weeks, and this time she did not close it. She did not confront him that night. I want to be clear about this because I think it matters. Cyndi was not the kind of person who reacted immediately. She was the kind of person who gathered herself first, who made sure she knew what she wanted to say before she said it, who understood that a conversation like this, a conversation where everything might change, required more than just the courage to start it. It required a clarity about where she wanted to go. She spent 2 days thinking. She spent those 2 days in the garage more than she usually was, not hiding, processing. She bottled 4 more of her Cabernet Franc, the batch she called Honest, and she labeled each one carefully and stood them in a row on the bottom shelf. She thought about honesty, what it cost, what it protects, what happens to a relationship when one person is being honest and the other is not, whether honesty offered freely could open a door for honesty to return. On a Sunday evening after dinner, when the house was quiet and Christopher was sitting in the living room, she came out of the garage. She sat down across from him. She did not have her notebook. She had not planned a speech. She had decided, in the end, to just be honest, to say the things simply, without accusation, without armor. "Christopher," she said, "I need to talk to you about something that I think we both know is happening." He looked at her, and the thing that she noticed, the thing that stayed with her later, that she turned over and over in her mind was that he did not look surprised. He looked tired, bone deep, behind the eyes, carrying something too heavy, tired, like a man who had been waiting for the conversation and dreading it, and maybe, somewhere, very quiet inside of himself, relieved that it had finally arrived. "I know," he said. And then he said nothing else for a very long time. They sat in the quiet. And sometimes I think about this a lot. Sometimes the most important thing that happens in a relationship is not the words. It's the willingness to sit in the quiet together and not leave. I want to talk about something that does not get discussed enough in the caregiver space. What it feels like to love someone who is actively addictive. Not from a clinical distance, not with the comfortable language of boundary setting and self-care and detachment with love. I mean the raw, unmanaged, middle-of-the-night reality of it. Because caregiving is already so much. It is already the appointments, the medications, the insurance calls, and the forms and the fatigue that sits in your bones and does not leave. It is already the grief of watching someone you love not be who they were. It is already the loneliness of being the person holding everything while everyone simply gets to live their lives. And then you layer active addiction on top of that. You layer the lies, the hiding, the trips that do not add up, the money you cannot quite account for, the person who looks like your husband but is not quite your husband, the constant low-grade vigilance of trying to figure out what is real and what is performance. And you do all of this while you're still loving them, while also being their caregiver, while also running the household and keeping the appointments and being, for all external appearances, completely fine. This is a particular kind of weight that most people never have to carry. And if you're carrying it right now, if this story is feeling less like a story and more like a mirror, I want you to hear this. You are not crazy. You are not overreacting. You are not responsible for what is happening, and you do not have to carry this alone. Because caregiving, it does something to you. It takes pieces of you that you did not know you were giving. And when you add addiction into that equation, when the person you are caring for is also the source of the chaos, it can make you feel like you are disappearing. You are not disappearing. You are just very, very tired. And there is a difference. The night after the Sunday conversation, Cyndi did not sleep well. She lay awake for a long time, listening to Christopher breathe beside her. He had fallen asleep quickly, the particular heavy sleep of someone who has finally put something down. She envied him that, a little. The way he could release into sleep while she stayed in her head, turning everything over. At 2 a.m, she got up. She went to the garage. She did not check any of her existing batches. She did not open her notebook. She just stood in the garage, in the dark for a while, letting her eyes adjust, breathing in the smell of fermentation and wood and the particular mineral coldness of Napa at night. And then she got out her new carboy. She did not have grapes. She did not have a plan. She was not starting a batch in a practical sense. She was just doing the thing she did when the world was too much. She was making space for something new to begin. She wrote at the top of a fresh page in her notebook, "I do not know what this one will be yet, but I know I need to start it." And then, below that, something she had not planned to write. She wrote, "I am not just his caregiver. I am also someone who deserves to be cared for." She stared at that sentence for a long time. Then she turned off the garage light and went back inside. She did not sleep, but she felt for the first time in a long time like herself. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment and speak directly to the caregiver who is in Cyndi's situation right now. If you are caring for someone who is struggling with opioid dependency, whether it is acknowledged or still hidden, whether you are at the beginning of this realization or in the thick of it, there are resources specifically designed for you. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has a national helpline available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The number is 1-800-662-4357. It is free, confidential, and available in English and Spanish. It is not just for people who are struggling with addiction themselves. It is for families. It is for caregivers. It is for the person watching someone they love and not knowing what to do next. Al-Anon, which most people associate with alcoholism, but which also supports families of people struggling with any substance dependency, has meetings in every state and virtually as well. It was created specifically for the person in Cyndi's position, the person who loves someone with an addiction and needs support that is just for them. And please, if you are Cyndi right now, please talk to your own doctor about your stress levels, about your sleep, about what you are carrying, because caregivers have bodies too, and those bodies need attention. You deserve a Dr. Reyes too. Christopher did not stop immediately after Sunday conversation. I want to be honest about that, because I think there is a tendency in storytelling, in the way we talk about recovery, in the way we want things to go, to have the conversation to be a turning point, to have the honesty be a solution. Real life is messier than that. Real life has a few more weeks of stumbling. A relapse Cyndi found out about not because Christopher told her, but because she found a receipt in a jacket pocket. Another conversation, a harder one, and then finally a different kind of appointment, not with Dr. Reyes, but with an addiction specialist, a person whose entire practice was built around exactly the intersection of TBI and opioid dependency. That appointment was the beginning of something real, but it was not the end of something hard. Recovery is not a destination. It is a direction. And in the early weeks of moving in that direction are often the most turbulent, the most uncertain, the most likely to make everyone in the household feel like they are on a boat in rough water with no clear sight of shore. Cyndi kept making wine. She kept writing in her notebook. She kept exhaling in the garage when the house got too heavy. She kept loving Christopher, not perfectly, not without anger, not without grief, but steadily. The way good wine is made, slowly, attentively, with the understanding that you cannot rush what needs time. What stayed with me, what I kept coming back to when I think about Cyndi in this period, is something she said that I think is one of the truest things that I've ever heard about caregiving. She said, "I had to learn the difference between holding on and holding up. Holding on is for me. Holding up is for him. And I had to figure out how to deal with both at the same time without losing either one. Holding on and holding up." I think every caregiver who has ever loved someone through something hard knows exactly what she means. Here we are, episode 4, the fourth pressing. And I want to ask you something before I let you go today. What are you carrying right now that you have not named? What is in your notebook, written in 2-word entries, waiting for you to be ready to read it all the way through? What is the thing you know but are not yet ready to know? I ask not to push you. I ask because I think naming things is the beginning of everything, not the end of the hardship, not the solution, but the beginning of being able to actually see what you are dealing with. And you cannot deal with what you cannot see. Cyndi could see it now, and what she is learning, what this whole series is really about, is that seeing clearly is not the same as knowing what to do, but it is where everything real begins. Pour, pause, pay attention to your wine, to your person, to yourself, especially yourself. Before I sign off today, I want to remind you about the Take Care Time Respite Box. This bi-monthly subscription box is curated specifically for caregivers, for you, not the person you're caring for the person doing the caring. The May-June box is wine-themed, and I chose that theme intentionally. with this series in mind because wine, at its best, is about patience and attention and the belief that something beautiful can come out of the process that requires more time than feels more comfortable. That is you. That is what you're doing every single day. This box is filled with items that are just for you, items designed to help you exhale, to help you find your garage, wherever your garage is. You can view the May-June wine-themed respite box at takecaretime.com. That's takecaretime.com. Go look and then treat yourself to it because you have earned it and because rest is not a reward, it is a requirement. And finally, I want to hear from you. If this series has touched something in your life, if Cyndi's story has felt like your story, if you have been the caregiver watching someone you love disappear a little at a time behind a problem that has no easy answers, I want to know your story because your story matters, not just to me, to the caregivers who are listening right now and feeling alone. You can reach me at podcast@takecaretime.com. That's podcast@takecaretime.com. With your permission, your experience may become part of this show because the best stories, the ones that actually change people, are the ones that are true. Next time on Pour, Pause, Pay Attention, Christopher enters treatment, and Cyndi, for the first time in longer than she can remember, has to figure out what to do with a house that is quiet. Not the quiet of someone sleeping in the next room, the quiet of someone who is not there. And the new batch she started at 2 a.m. finally has a name, and she calls it Still Here. Please note that this episode features reenactments and dramatized details. While in most cases the exact verbatim dialogue may not be known, all dramatizations are grounded in thorough research and crafted to honor the stories shared. To respect the privacy and confidentiality of the individuals involved, names and some identifying details have been changed. Until next week, take care.